When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other?" He continued, "I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." Then 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with the others, because he was afraid that harm might come to him. So Israel's sons were among those who went to buy grain, for there was famine in the land of Canaan also. Now Joseph was the governor of the land, the person who sold grain to all its people. So when Joseph's brothers arrived, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. As soon as Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he asked. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected." "No, my lord," they answered. "Your servants have come to buy food. We are all the sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." "No," he said to them, "you have come to see where our land is unprotected." But they replied, "Your servants were 12 brothers, the sons of one man who lives in the land of Canaan. The youngest is now with our father, and one is no more." Joseph said to them, "It is just as I told you, you are spies, and this is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you will not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of your number to get your brother. The rest of you will be kept in prison, so that your words may be tested to see if you are telling the truth. If you are not, then as surely as Pharaoh lives, you are spies." And he put them all in custody for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers stay here in prison, while the rest of you go and take grain back for your starving households. But you must bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified and that you may not die." This they proceeded to do. They said to one another, "Surely we are being punished because of our brother. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us." Reuben replied, "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, but you wouldn't listen? Now we must give an accounting for his blood." They did not realize that Joseph could understand them, since he was using an interpreter. He turned away from them and began to weep, but then came back and spoke to them again. He had Simeon taken from them and bound before their eyes. Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain, to put each man's silver back in his sack, and to give them provisions for their journey. After this was done for them, they loaded their grain on their donkeys and left. At the place where they stopped for the night, one of them opened his sack to get feed for his donkey, and he saw his silver in the mouth of his sack. "My silver has been returned," he said to his brothers. "Here it is in my sack." Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling and said, "What is this that God has done to us?" When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. They said, "The man who is lord over the land spoke harshly to us and treated us as though we were spying on the land. But we said to him, 'We are honest men, we are not spies. We were 12 brothers, sons of one father. One is no more, and the youngest is now with our father in Canaan.' Then the man who is lord over the land said to us, 'This is how I will know whether you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take food for your starving households and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, so I will know that you are not spies but honest men. Then I will give your brother back to you, and you can trade in the land." As they were emptying their sacks, there in each man's sack was his pouch of silver. When they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Then Reuben said to his father, "You may put both of my sons to death if I do not bring him back to you. Entrust him to my care, and I will bring him back." But Jacob said, "My son will not go down there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow."
Sorry, I'm not sure if that was heard. Thank you ever so much, Cora. Am I back on? You cancel the spotlight on Cora, please, Phil. Manage that now? Yeah, well done. Brilliant. Okay. Well, let's dive straight into that passage, shall we, and start thinking about what God has to say to us this evening. And you'll see on the screen, I've entitled tonight's sermon, "Confronted by Our Sin." Now, with the life of Joseph particularly, it's really important to always keep all the elements of the story in the context of the whole. It would be very easy to lift some of the elements out and take them in the wrong way without keeping them in view of the whole. And so we've got to remember, as we're working through the story of Joseph, that it was written to a people who had been rescued by Egypt. It's Moses who writes Genesis. It was written originally for the people who were perhaps in the wilderness on the way to the promised land. It was helping them to understand why they'd been in Egypt and what God's purposes were as they came out. But also, you've got to remember that the punchline, if you like, of the life of Joseph, the story, is what we've got on the screen. God intended it for good. Joseph says to his brothers in Genesis 50, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." That's the overall banner. That's the overall lesson to learn from the life of Joseph. Now, I think why this evening's chapter 42, is so important is because we could hear that overall message, you meant it for good, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good, and hear that as telling us that therefore it doesn't matter how we've behaved. It doesn't matter what we do, because God's going to work it out all right in the end, and therefore we can do what we like and sit back and behave how we will, because it's okay, because God will sort it all out. Even if we're behaving wickedly, he's going to take that and work it for good. And you can therefore live as you please, because it all works out in the end. And I think that's why this passage, this chapter, is so important in the story of Joseph, given the overall message. So let's have a look at this chapter and see why it teaches what I think it does in terms of being confronted by our own sin. So let's look at verses 1 to 5 to start with, and see that this is all about going to Egypt. You'll remember last week we left it with Joseph having been made prime minister, having interpreted Pharaoh's dream. There have been 7 years of abundance, and now we're heading into famine. And Joseph has stored food within Egypt in preparation for the famine. And now people from all over the known world are coming to Egypt because there isn't grain anywhere else. But there is grain in Egypt. And so it's emphasized 3 times for us in these opening verses. When Jacob heard there was grain in Egypt, he said to his boys, "I've heard there was grain in Egypt." And then the 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. There's grain in Egypt. That's the big thing that's going on here in these opening verses. It's connecting us to the last chapter. There's been this sense of inevitability. We were warned of it at the end of the last chapter, that the famine was throughout the whole known world, and therefore it's affecting Joseph's family back in Canaan. And so they've got to head down to Egypt. But we're also reminded of a previous theme as well, that Jacob is not prepared to send Benjamin with the 10 brothers. He's already lost Joseph. As far as Jacob is aware, Joseph has been killed by a wild animal some 20 years previously. And Benjamin is the only son now of his his second wife, but the lady he wanted to marry first. And therefore his most precious child out of this family of 12 sons. And he's frightened that he's going to lose Benjamin. And so he's not going to send Benjamin. Benjamin stays at home. The 10 brothers go down to Egypt. And we're reminded again, there's famine in Canaan. They have to go down to Egypt for grain. And so we've got this movement from Canaan to Egypt of Joseph's 10 brothers coming down to Egypt. But Jacob afraid for Benjamin because of what's happened, as far as he knows, to Joseph. So that's verses 1 to 5. Secondly, look at verses 6 to 12. A dream fulfilled. A dream fulfilled. It's amazing that when they head down to Egypt, when they arrive at where the grain is being distributed, who's not only overseeing that distribution, but is present as they come to collect the grain, but Joseph himself. And because he's the governor of the land, because he's the second most important person in the land behind Pharaoh, when his brothers arrive, they hit the decks. They bow down to him with their faces to the ground. And as you read that, and if you keep the whole story of Joseph in your mind, there is a remarkable bell ringing. 20 years previously, Joseph had dreamed that his brother's sheaves had bowed down to his sheaf. And the interpretation was that his brothers would bow down to him, and they mocked him for it, and they resisted. And here now, without even being aware of it, without him having engineered it, they are on their faces before him. And we're told in these verses that he recognized them, he knew who they were, but they didn't recognize him. Bear in mind that he's been gone for some years. They think he's dead. As far as they know, he was sold into slavery and he's no more. He's now dressed like an Egyptian. He's clean shaven. He's the governor. There's no way their minds would have coped with expecting that and processing that. And so they just didn't recognize him, although he understood who they were straight away. And then plays out a really interesting twist in the plot. After Joseph recognized his brothers, we read in verse 8, they did not recognize him. Then he remembered his dreams about them. Now that's really important. He remembered his dreams about them. The first dream was that his brothers would bow down to him. His second dream was that his mother and father and brothers would bow down to him. The first has now been fulfilled. The second hasn't, but surely is going to be. How's that going to happen? How's that going to come about? How's all that going to work? And so we now hear Joseph say to these brothers of his, "You are spies." Now remember that they'd accused him of, well, we don't read that they'd accused him, but we're told that he took a report of them back to his father, a bad report about their behavior. He'd spied on them, if you were like. And now as they arrive in the land of Egypt, he accuses them of being spies. He says, "You've come to see where the land is unprotected." And they're horrified, verse 10. "No, my lord," they answered, "your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. Your servants are honest men, not spies." Now, I think we're supposed to laugh out loud at this point. They're terrified, and their central plea is that we're honest men. These are the brothers who lied to Jacob and said that Joseph had been killed by a wild animal when they'd sold him into slavery. These are the brothers who for the last 10 years have been living out that lie. Sorry, the last 20 years have been living out that lie. Honest men. And so Joseph presses again, saying, "No, you're spies. You've come to see where our land is unprotected." There is a beginning now of a tension between Joseph and the brothers as we begin to see what's at stake, as their honesty is their defense and he's accusing them of lying. So the dream has been fulfilled. He's seen one dream fulfilled as his brothers bow down to him. He's still got the expectation of his father and mother and brothers bowing down to him. So thirdly, this evening, look at verses 13 to 20 and see the testing the truth of their words. Throughout this passage then, Joseph says, I'm going to test the truthfulness of your words. I think you're spies. You're saying you're honest men. Let's put your word to the test. Can you see that in verse 15? This is how you will be tested. As surely as Pharaoh lives, you're not going to leave this place until your youngest brother comes here. You can send one of your brothers home to bring him. And when he turns up, when I know there's another brother, I'll know that you're not lying, and I'll know that you're honest men. And having told them he's going to test their honesty, he puts them all in custody for 3 days. 3 days in prison. And then on the third day, Joseph comes again. Now it's very interesting. In verse 15, he'd said, as surely as Pharaoh lives. He uses Pharaoh's name in an oath, which would have been entirely expected of him by them because he was an Egyptian. But then in verse 18, he comes to them after 3 days in prison and says, do this and you will live, for I fear God. For I fear God. If you are honest men, here's the test again. If you really are honest, let one of your brothers stay here in prison while the rest of you go home. There's been a shift from all of you stay apart from one who goes home to now one of you stay while the rest go home. But the rest who go home, you can take your grain back with you for your starving households, but you must bring your youngest brother to me so that your words may be verified. Are you really honest? Can I trust your word? That you may not die. The stakes are really high now. The consequence of the falsehood of their words would be death. They've got to prove the truthfulness of their words when for 20 years they've been living with a lie. And at this point, we come to the middle of the passage, and I think this is the heart of the message. Look at their response in verses 21 and 22 as they sense the punishment for their sin. As Joseph challenges them over the truthfulness of their words, and they've got to leave one of them behind to go and fetch the younger brother, who their father won't let come because of possible harm, they said to one another, verse 21, surely we are being punished because of our brother. And listen to this. We saw how distressed he was when he pleaded with us for his life, but we would not listen. That's why this distress has come on us. The brothers at this point are feeling really under God's microscope. They really are feeling as though he's pressing in, and they're convinced that they're in this uncomfortable position because of what they did to Joseph. And the scene that they paint in verse 21 is one of utter terror, isn't it? That as Joseph was in that cistern 20 years ago, and they were talking about killing him, and then they decided to sell him to the slave traders to take him down to Egypt. In all of that, Joseph wasn't just sitting there with some seraphic grin on his face, trusting in God's providence. No, he was on his knees begging them to spare his life. He was full of distress, and they completely ignored it. They would not listen. And they sense now that action is bouncing back on them. And Reuben just prods in the knife because he wasn't there when they did sell him. In the end, Reuben replied, didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy, but you wouldn't listen? Now we must give an accounting for his blood. They are really feeling as though they've been totally exposed. On the one hand, they're saying to this Lord of Egypt, we're honest men. And here they're saying to themselves, we're for the high jump. Our hearts have been exposed for what we've done. We're going to have to give account for his blood. Now, at this point, if you didn't know what comes next, you might be thinking, is Joseph just enjoying the power trip here? Is he really enjoying making the most of making his brothers feel really miserable? And is he just thinking, revenge, I've got my chance now. They treated me so badly 20 years ago, and boy, am I going to make them miserable now. Is that what's going on? Well, you could read the story like that, except that look what happens next. They've been speaking in their own language, Hebrew, presumably. And Joseph, up until this point, has been using an interpreter. They presume he speaks Egyptian and therefore he wouldn't understand, which is why they can have the conversation in front of him as openly as they have. But as Joseph's listening in, what's his response as they talk about what they did to him? He doesn't go, yes, squirm, brothers. He turns away and begins to weep. He's emotionally engaged in this, not with some sense of revenge, but with a sense of sorrow over what they've done. I guess with a sense of heavy-heartedness as he sees them recognizing the pain that they've caused. And then he composes himself and comes back, and he takes Simeon from them. I can't see whether the Nevins are with us this evening. I've only got people whose videos are on, but Simeon, I apologize for this bit of the story. Okay, of all the 12 brothers, they decide to keep Simeon in prison. And I don't know why. No idea. One possibility is he's the next oldest under Reuben from the first wife, Leah. And because Reuben at least tried to help Joseph, he's the next one that's accountable. But I don't really know. I don't really know. But Joseph arranges then for the 9 brothers to be sent home and Simeon to be kept behind. And then we see something of Joseph's heart and generosity as he not only gives orders for their bags to be full of grain, that was kind, given that he's just accused them of being spies, but then he puts their money back in the bags and gives them provisions for their journey. All that was done for them. There's an act of generosity here on his part. But actually, ironically, that generosity of Joseph towards his brothers only adds to their guilt, because when they get to the first stopping grounds, after a day's travel away from Egypt, and one of the brothers goes to his bag to get some grain out to presumably pound some flour and bake some bread for their evening meal, he realizes that his silver is in the top of his sack. And what's the response in verse 28? Their hearts sank, and they turned to each other trembling. And they said, what is this that God has done to us? They are scared silly. This is well out of their control. Their sin has been exposed. They've been reminded of the lie that they've been living with. And now the plot just seems to get thicker and thicker, and they sense more and more trouble ahead. And yet, verses 29 to 38, when they get home, they report this to their father. And as they report it 3 times, they say to their father that they'd said to the lords in Egypt that they were honest men. Can you see? Verse 31, we said to him, we are honest men. Verse 33, he'd said to them, this is how I will know whether you are honest men. Verse 34, not spies, but honest men. Again, it's the whole story is pressing in on the truthfulness of their word, and they're reporting back to their father that what's at stake is our honesty. And this is the father they've been lying to for 20 years. You just sense that it's bang, bang, bang to their conscience. It's a bit like Peter and Jesus, isn't it? Do you remember Peter, who 3 times said, I do not know Jesus. I don't know the man. May God rain curses down on me if I know Jesus. I don't know him. And then Jesus looked at Peter after his resurrection and said, Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? You sense the pressing in. in Peter's answers, Lord, you know that I love you. You sense the anguish of heart as he's challenged about his life. And here for the brothers, they're back to their father who they've been lying to for 20 years. He thinks his son's been killed. They sold him into slavery. What a lie to live with for 20 years. And they're coming back and saying, we're on trial as to our honesty. And then as they empty their sacks to their father, their own silver is in every sack. And verse 35, when they and their father saw the money pouches, they were frightened. They were scared, silly. And now the weight of what's happened begins to bear down on Jacob as he accuses them of depriving him of his children. It's their fault that Joseph is no more, that Simeon is no more. He's been left in Egypt, and now they want to take Benjamin away. And Jacob just senses that everything is against him. And Jacob says, there's no way you're going back with Benjamin. I'm not losing another one. Mind you, look carefully at his language in verse 38. My son, not my sons, but my son, will not go down with you there with you. His brother is dead, and he is the only one left. This is what had sparked the jealousy in the first place, that Jacob had loved Joseph more than all the others. And now he's almost saying to them, you lot don't count. It's just Benjamin. That's all I've got that matters. And if harm comes to him on the journey you are taking, you will bring my grey head down to the grave in sorrow. Now, how do the brothers hear that? They've been lying for 20 years about what's happened to Joseph. Joseph's disappearance is their fault. And now they're watching their father process the news that he's got to let go of Benjamin if he wants Simeon back and if he wants food in the future. And so as we get to the end of the chapter, the whole chapter has been about the truthfulness of the brothers' words. It's been pressing in on their sin. It's been exposing them for their wickedness. It's been challenging them. They are sensing the weight of the way that they've been living. Because it's all very well that they meant it for good and God meant it for good. Sorry, they meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. But actually, in the process of God working it out, they need to be changed. They need to repent of their sin. They need to confess that sin. They need to put it right. Otherwise, it won't be good for them. If they're going to be rescued as part of God's family through his provision of Joseph, if they're going to be rescued from the famine in Canaan and brought into the safety of Joseph's leadership and care, their hearts need to be put right. This can't continue. God is not going to work it for good while this canker continues at the heart of the family of his people. It's got to be addressed. It's got to be dealt with. It's got to be exposed. It's got to be repented of. The sins of the brothers has to be dealt with as part of their rescue. And folks, I think we ought to let the weight of that just sink into our hearts and minds this evening. We believe in a good God. We believe in a sovereign Lord. We believe in a God who, according to Romans 8:28, is working everything for the good of his people. It does give us a confidence in the trials of life, in the mistakes and the mess that we make, that actually he's overruling that where sin abounds, grace abounds much more, and he's working for the good. But that doesn't mean that our sin can continue, that we can live as though there's no consequence to our sin. See, God is not just a rescuer, he's a sanctifier. He's a purifier. He gives us new hearts. He purges out the wickedness. He exposes it and challenges it and deals with it. And so as his people, we should expect that not only can we rejoice in the provision of a rescuer, the Lord Jesus Christ, who Joseph is a type of and points us to, not only in the provision of a secure future, as God provides for his people, as he led them into Egypt so they'd survive the famine and led them out of Egypt back to the promised land, not only be confident in that future, but also we can be confident that he's going to deal with what's in here. He doesn't let it go. There is always a tight link in Scripture between God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Between what God is doing through us, but also and for us, but also in us. He works in as we work out. And so it's important that we read this chapter and feel its weight and recognize the seriousness of sin in our lives. Thankful that it's forgiven in Jesus, but conscious that the attitudes that led to it need to be dealt with, need to be exposed, that our hard-heartedness towards our sin needs to be broken so that we'll change and be the people that he intends.